Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome and hello to the 2023 Keep It Clean Pre-Harvest Tips and Tools webinar. Thanks for being here today. My name is Jeff English. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications with Pulse Canada here in Winnipeg. I'll be the moderator for today's session. As you all know, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable access to major international markets. Today, our panelists will speak to what it takes to protect the marketability of Canada's canola, cereal, and pulse crops. Topics covered will include proper staging for pre-harvest glyphosate application, the importance of following pre-harvest intervals for crop protection products, as well as scouting for disease. Before I get started, I'll just review a little bit of housekeeping measures with respect to Zoom webinar. On your screen, you should see both a chat and a Q&A tab. Please use the chat for hellos and general comments. Maybe drop in there where you're tuning in from today would be great. Please submit any questions through the Q&A tab. Questions will be reviewed and responded to at the end of the session. We'll hold all questions and give each panelist an opportunity to help answer them. But please feel free to submit them as we go along, and we'll do our best to answer them all. If you do have any technical difficulties during the webinar, let us know in the chat tab, or you can email info@keepitclean.ca. As a final reminder, today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording of today's session will be emailed out to all participants and posted to the website, keepitclean.ca. We do have a lot to cover, so let's get started. I'm pleased to be joined today by three speakers. Please welcome Krista Zuzak, Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada, Greg Bartley, Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality for us here at Pulse Canada, and Ian Epp, Agronomy Specialist with the Canola Council of Canada. I'm going to begin by passing the mic over to Krista, who's going to provide an overview of the topics we'll be covering today. Krista, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And as Jeff mentioned, my name is Krista Zuzak with Cereals Canada, and I'm going to start off the webinar today. Next slide, please. So to really set the scene for what we're talking about today with our pre-harvest tips and tools is just really keeping in mind how important Canadian agriculture is from an export perspective. So because we do produce so much beyond what we need for our domestic demand for food, we really do need to keep in mind market access and those requirements that we see with our export partners. And just a bit of a screenshot in the bottom of the screen, what you'll see there is that for crops like canola, pulses, and cereals, we do have a lot of countries that we have to think about for these export requirements. And maintaining market access really does have a lot to do with being able to maintain our ability to export. Next slide, please. As well, when we think about exports, we have to also think about the standards that are set by our importing countries. So not only do we have domestic requirements, but like other countries, we also have the right to set standards, to see these rules and regulations that are created. And these are there to protect human, plant, animal, and environmental health, but we also need to think about those for trade. So when we see these sanitary and phytosanitary requirements for markets, we think about things like insects or diseases or weeds or weed seeds, but we really want to focus that these are based on science. And unfortunately, what we are seeing with some importing countries of Canadian grains is kind of an erosion of our science-based approach, or what we're seeing more and more commonly is rather than these regulations and these standards being set according to science, they're being made based on other factors like political. So some of the most recent ones you might have seen in the news would be the European Union and their farm to fork strategy. So this includes a reduction in pesticides, for example, as well as the idea of mirror clauses. So essentially the changes that are being made in the EU also have those being applied to exports or to what they're importing from other countries like Canada. Another concerning one we've seen in the news recently is the decree that came out of Mexico. So the presidential decree that would essentially move towards banning GM corn as well as banning glyphosate. So this is something that we can definitely see causing an issue when these are not based in science and what these can mean for big imports in Canada. Next slide, please. So when we think about these kind of issues that we see as an industry, what are we doing to address these? So we have both proactive and reactive approaches that we take. So more on the reactive side would be monitoring policy and regulation in export markets. So that then when there is an issue, we're working with our Canadian regulators like CFIA or PMRA to be able to address those market access issues. However, on the more proactive side, which is where we prefer to stay, this would be more of our advocacy efforts. And as I already mentioned, with having a science-based approach to policy and to decision-making, this is something we want to see both domestically and in our export markets. So we have a few avenues that we can explore this. So as value chain organizations and with our industry partners, we can work through free trade agreements and ensuring that there's language in there about maintaining that science-based approach, especially when we think about things like maximum residue limits for crop protection products. We also have the avenue of the World Trade Organization. So I mentioned some of those, essentially the rules that countries are free to make about their sanitary and phytosanitary to protect the environment and human health and their exports. So a lot of these go through the World Trade Organization and how those rules are addressed or how those rules can be creative. And in addition, we do see some submissions or consultations when there are changes that come through the World Trade Organization, and we can help address those. And also we have the utilization of international standards or having more of a harmonized approach. So this could include something like Codex. So for maximum residue limits, having the Codex Alimentarius, so having an international standard setting body that's available that provides some of those maximum residue limits. And we do encourage the adoption of those so that we don't have MRL misalignments. And finally, one of the focuses that we want to talk about today that industry is working on is being able to provide this information to growers, agronomists, and exporters and help manage this short-term risk. So really thinking about MRL non-compliance and starting right at the stages of growing and on the farm and what we can do there to be able to provide some of this information so we can hopefully avoid some of these issues for market access going forward. Next slide. So this brings us to our Keep It Clean program. So our Keep It Clean program is the joint initiative of the Canola Council of Canada, Cereals Canada, Pulse Canada, as well as the Prairie Oak Growers Association, really with the tagline to grow market-ready crops. So this includes providing growers and crop advisors resources to be able to do this. Our Keep It Clean program includes timely updates on potential market access risks, providing resources for on-farm best practices, and really focusing on how we can meet those standards that are both domestic and those of our export customers, including webinars like today. Next slide, please. So the next part I want to walk you through is our 5 simple tips. So kind of one of the cornerstones of our Keep It Clean program are these 5 simple tips that we can distill down that really help us keep those markets open. And tip number 1 is use acceptable pesticides only. This is an interesting one because normally we think about using registered pesticides, which can be slightly different. So using acceptable pesticides only does only apply to crop protection products that are registered here in Canada, but also keeping in mind that there may be some that although they are registered on crops here in Canada, they can still pose market access risks. So value chain organizations like the Canola Council, Pulse Canada, and Cereals Canada help play a role in monitoring a lot of these or assessing products that are registered on those crops and thinking about what other kind of downstream impacts there might be, especially with MRLs, for example, or maximum residue limits. So we may have an issue where it's something that's registered for a crop or for a certain use pattern in Canada. However, perhaps it creates MRL issues because of either residues that are produced, or perhaps there are missing or misaligned MRLs in some of our major trading partner countries. So one of the best ways we can also help mitigate this risk is talking to your grain buyer to ensure the products you're using are acceptable in both domestic and export markets. And another part to consider is our product advisory that I will talk more about. So this includes some categorization of products that might be registered in Canada on those crops. However, they may cause market access risks, and we're able to communicate that. Next slide, please. So tip number 2 is to always read and follow the label. This is especially timely and pertinent for today's webinar when we're thinking about pre-harvest, and we have our growing season well underway and nearing harvest in some areas. So when we think about always read and follow the label, this includes some key factors. So 1 would be the application rate, 2 would be the timing, and 3rd would be the pre-harvest interval. So really, we want to think about the registered rate, keeping in mind that off-label use is illegal for a multitude of reasons, but it can also cause some problems with MRLs, for example, but always thinking about the rate that we're applying. Secondly is our timing. So this is applying our crop protection products only at the product's label recommended crop stage. So again, that's also important from a residue perspective, but also just from a best management practices efficiency point on your farm. And finally, the 3rd part of always read and follow the label would be your PHI. So we're going to talk a little bit about another tool that we have for your pre-harvest interval that's available through Keep It Clean, but really sticking to that pre-harvest interval. So the number of days between spraying and cutting your crop, or applying crop protection products and cutting your crop, is very important. And sometimes some of the earlier season products are less concerning for something like this because they have a little more time to work their way through the crop. However, this is very important when we think about those later applied products, or something like insecticides, or as we're going to talk about today, pre-harvest glyphosate, where we really want to make sure we're not applying things too early, or we're not cutting closer than we should into that pre-harvest interval. Next slide, please. So tip number 3 is manage disease pressures. So when we think about managing disease pressures, this applies to all of our crops, and I'm going to talk through 2 examples with you today. So there can be reasons, obviously, for yield protection to want to manage disease and for the health of your crops, but there can also be market access issues that we need to consider. So there are several best management practices through Keep It Clean to help manage those disease pressures. So this would include things like growing disease-resistant varieties when they're available, or planning crop rotations to manage disease. So you might have diseases that tend to overwinter or survive well in stubble. So this could be things like blackleg in canola, or Fusarium head blight in cereals. So we really want to think about, using the best resistance that we have possible, but also thinking about our crop rotations so that we can really start to reduce that disease or have it break down from year to year. We can also think about factors like planting clean seed, seed treatments where they're available and effective when we do have those higher risk conditions. Then again, these both provide agronomic benefits, but also disease prevention benefits from the market access side. So for something like Fusarium head blight, for example, not only is it something that can affect your yield and the quality of your cereal grain that you're producing, but it can also cause a market access issue. And this would be because Fusarium head blight, because Fusarium head blight produces the mycotoxin DON, or deoxynivalenol. This is something we want to reduce because we do have countries that import Canadian wheat or Canadian grains that have maximum limits in place. So similar to a maximum residue limit, they have maximum limits on contaminants, including DON. And we do see these changing and tightening over time in a lot of countries. So we really want to be, managing that risk and managing Fusarium head blight while it's in the field and before it's in the bin and before we see those export issues. Also keeping in mind that something like Fusarium head blight can be so weather dependent. So we really do need to have all of the tools in our toolbox possible. And this would really go along with thinking about having an integrated pest management approach for managing diseases, no matter the crop. Next slide, please. And tip number 4 is store your crop properly. So again, this can be about, when you're thinking during the summer and you're cleaning out your bins before you're storing your crop, you might want to use something like Malathion to clean your bins out as a bin treatment. However, it can cause issues down the line when, you've harvested your canola, and if canola is going to be going into that bin that has had Malathion in it, that can cause a market access issue. So this is one of those tips just to remember as we go through the growing season, as we're going to be moving into putting that grain in the bins, that we never want to use Malathion for the bins that we're going to be storing canola in, or, to treat those bins in advance and thinking about where your canola is going. And just some general good practices for your bins about, keeping them cool, dry, well ventilated, and to check their condition regularly. This can also have an impact on some storage diseases that we see. So for example, in wheat, ochratoxin A is something that, develops more in certain conditions in bins, such as when they're not kept dry. So this is another reason to think about this, because ochratoxin A is something that can also cause a market access issue with some of the countries that we export wheat to. Next slide, please. And finally, we get to tip number 5. So this is our last of our 5 simple tips. And this would be deliver what you declare. So the good reminder that the declaration of eligibility affidavit that you sign at the elevator is a legally binding document. So whether, mistakes on it are intentional or unintentional, these can have consequences, and they are something that can be traced back to the farm. As well, we don't want to think about that, the liability that we have to deal with, or perhaps the cost of it if we do have contamination of a bin or of a shipment. So when we do sign that declaration of eligibility affidavit, it does include things like growing registered varieties. So especially for canola, and you're signing that you are only growing, and in that case, delivering on registered varieties of canola. And for other crops like cereals, for example, or for pulses, and as well as for canola, we also think about crop protection products used. So there may be on your declaration of eligibility affidavit, you are signing that you have not applied certain crop protection products during the growing season or at pre-harvest for each of the crops. And as well, today our commodity associations on the line, so Pulse Canola, Canola Council of Canada, and Cereals Canada are all going to talk about, in particular, the pre-harvest considerations and what we should be making for that end of the year delivery. Next slide, please. So these resources that I've been referring to, including our product advisory and some other information and previous webinars that we've held, can all be found on the Keep It Clean website under Tools and Resources. So even today in our presentation, there are some of these content and graphics that we have that have been updated. So these are all accessible and you can download them online, as well as finding our product advisory. I'm going to talk to you a bit about our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. And as I mentioned, previously recorded webinars, including today's, will be available on the website. Next slide, please. So our pre-harvest glyphosate pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. So this is located on our website, and you can find it under that tools download. So we do have it a general one, and then we have specifically for each crop also something you can see on there. As well, it's worth mentioning, to go with our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide, we also have a video. So this video is also available on the website. And really, when we think about pre-harvest glyphosate, this is such an important tool for Canadian growers, but we really want to ensure that we have that use being appropriate to protect market access. So because it is so critical for market access, and there are maximum residue limits for glyphosate, and something that we want to keep in mind as well, because there is a lot of criticism about the use of glyphosate in Canadian agriculture. So keeping in mind that it also kind of has that market impact outside of MRLs necessarily, we've created this guide to have more information about this. So some of the information in the guide includes obviously to follow the label, but also thinking about applying pre-harvest glyphosate for weed control as it's registered, and not as a desiccant where it is not registered that way. As well, some of the follow the label information includes the grain moisture. So the critical grain moisture level for applying pre-harvest glyphosate is for that grain moisture level to be less than 30% in the least mature part of the field. So again, that reminder that glyphosate is registered for pre-harvest weed control and not as a desiccant. We really want to be mindful about what that moisture level looks like in grain when we're applying that. And something that we've added on in the last few years to the staging guide is to be mindful of regrowth and late tillering. So for example, a few years ago, what we were seeing is some late tillering that happened as a result of weather conditions. And really, especially with seed production, this can impact the grain moisture assessment when you're trying to assess that least mature part of your field. That would be that regrowth or that late tillering. And keeping in mind that, again, we don't want to be applying that pre-harvest glyphosate too early so that we have unacceptable residues in our grain. And as well, as we mentioned about following the label, that applying glyphosate as a desiccant would be considered an off-label use, and this is something that would be illegal and have these serious consequences and for market access. We also want to think about the importance of timing, as I mentioned, for making that application. So we do have additional resources online, as I mentioned, for each crop type for canola, cereals, and pulses for how we want to be staging our crops to make that pre-harvest glyphosate application, as well as respecting the pre-harvest interval that's on the label. Next slide, please. And this is our 2023 product advisory. So this is something that's released every spring that has updates made throughout the year where required. We do have a few new products on there for 2023. So these are noted on the product advisory that's on our website. And as well, we had a webinar on this earlier in the year that was recorded and is also available on the Keep It Clean site. So this also does include a section about glyphosate for each crop that it impacts and how that is or is not recommended to be used, in addition to following the label and thinking about those label directions. Next slide, please. And this brings us next to our pre-harvest interval calculator. So you may be more familiar with this. It was previously called the spray to swath interval calculator or the spray to swath calculator. So when we think about the renamed tool and what this is for, is to target that pre-harvest interval. So the pre-harvest interval is the minimum number of days that need to pass between applying a crop protection product and cutting your crop, whether this is by swathing or by straight cutting. So on these chemical or these pesticide labels, you might see it referred to as a pre-harvest interval, or often we call it a PHI. And the risk we want to highlight here is that sometimes cutting your crop before this interval has lapsed can leave unacceptable residues on harvested seed. So for example, glyphosate poses this risk. And when we think about using this tool that's available on our website, you can use this tool to calculate your PHI. So for this, you would enter your crop type and the product you've sprayed, and the calculator will tell you how many days after application you need to wait to cut your crop. As well, it's useful that you can find a tool, you can find a product using the tool that suits a specific timeline. So for this, you would enter your crop type and your pesticide type, and then there's a little slider that helps you indicate when you would like to cut the crop. And then this will tell you when, if any, there are products that are available to meet that timeline. So especially where sometimes, we have those shorter interval windows, this is something that can give us the options that we're looking for. Next slide, please. And from here, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Bartley to give the specific updates for pulses this year.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Krista. That was a good overview of kind of what to expect or what you can find within the Keep It Clean program. Essentially, you see, I guess the market background of, why this program is really needed. We get into 5 simple tips, and hopefully you can tell that everything centralized in this program is really related to one of those tips. Sometimes they overlap a bit, but really everything fits within those tips and kind of guides how we deliver the tool. So before we get into the pulse specific information, just going to take a pause here, make sure everyone's still with us. We're going to throw up a poll actually We just want to get an indication of who's joining us today, whether you're, from industry, whether you're a farmer. If you could just go ahead, fill out the poll here real quick, just give a sense of who we're talking to today. So we'll put this up for 5-10 seconds. Everyone can be here. Reminder again too, if you have any questions, the Q&A tab, please drop your questions in there. We hope to have a bit of a Q&A session at the end. And the chat's always open. Feel free to jump in, add some comments, tell us where you're from, all that. So I'll give a couple more seconds here, and then we'll wrap it up, and we'll keep on going. Okay, taking a look here, we have just a couple growers, a few agronomists, grain buyers, egg retailers, association. So really kind of a mixture across the industry. So glad to see everyone here today. And well, now we'll move into, we had that high level overview of the program. We're going to move into a bit of the crop specific information. So starting off with the pulses, something new for this year, kind of different approach is, we tend to focus on, what's in the product advisory, the kind of market restrictions, what products you need to be aware of that may cause market concern. I'm going to flip that around a bit and show you, in some cases, what's not on the advisory. So every year I tend to get questions, is this product safe to use? Yes or no. And I just want to highlight here that if you do not see a product on the advisory, that means there's no major market risk. We review all the products every year, and we tend to just show the products that have a show a market risk or a major market risk. So for pulses, the Diquat, Stafluphenicil, Carfentrazone, Flumioxazin, these products aren't on the advisory. So that's usually your indication that these products are safe to use from a marketing standpoint. Now, this isn't a case that's, showing you which products is best to use. It just gives that indication that there's no marketing risk for these, and there's still viable products that are options to use. So whether you use your crop protection guides or a lot of the grower associations have resources that pull together all the products that are available, just highlighting here that if you don't see the product on the advisory, chances are you're good to go from a marketing aspect. We'll jump into the next slide here. So from here, I'm just going to touch briefly on the products you do see on the advisory, kind of why they appear there, and some pre-harvest considerations from that aspect. So first off, chlorothalonil, this is a fungicide, highlighting here just because it's a late season fungicide for chickpea growers, and just highlighting again that potential marketing concern. The EU and Great Britain, I believe, but the EU has revoked these MRLs for chlorothalonil. So this is in place. It's at a default level of 0.01 parts per million. We're getting a bit more familiarity within the industry. When this first happened, we just didn't know. There's a couple of conflicting data sets that showed potential concern. As we get more familiar with this product and do a little more residue testing of farmers actually using the product, we're seeing that this is the level of risk is maybe lower than we initially anticipated. So highlighting here, the MRLs are gone. So if you are using this late season, go talk to your buyer, make sure that they're aware you're using the product, and make sure there's no marketing concerns. But we're getting fairly comfortable that this is leaning towards not as big of an issue as we initially indicated. Just highlighting real quickly though, the PMRA has proposed to cancel all outdoor uses of chlorothalonil. Extremely concerning, especially for chickpea growers, but for peas, lentils. When you have a multi-mode of action fungicide product and the kind of the fungicide insensitivity that we see in the industry, really concerning with the potential loss of a really important product that fits into an overall kind of plan towards fungicides. So anticipated, the PMRA has kind of gave an indication that 2024 is when we expect to see the final decision. So at Pulse Canada and other industry players keeping a close eye on this one, and hoping that the proposed cancellation doesn't go through. Hopefully that we can maintain this use pattern, as we know, especially for chickpea growers. We know that extremely important for chickpea growers. We'll jump to the next slide. So here, glufosinate ammonium, this has been on the advisory for a long time, and for good reason. So just highlighting again, differences between product classification in Eastern and Western Canada. Western Canada, we do have a registration on lentils on a few generic products. But just highlighting here that, from a marketing standpoint, this is a red do not use. We do not have the MRLs in export markets. There are detectable residues. So if you do use this product on lentils, it will cause a non-compliance. Some cases we hear about it. So just highlighting, glufosinate is not an option on lentils, even though the registration is there. I know it's a good product. It's tempting to use, but please do not use this product on lentils in Western Canada. If you look at Eastern Canada, there's a registration on dry beans. You know, the MRL situation, not any better other than MRL in Japan. That being said, the MRL is proposed to decrease in Japan, but again, with some monitoring data and some historical use of this product on dry beans in Ontario, we've been able to work with the companies to understand the residue risk, and showing that even though the MRL is dropping in Japan, our detectable residues are still below that lower MRL Japan. So just highlighting here is yellow, potential marketing concern, but there's a specific market class or two of dry beans where this is a viable option. So just keeping that option open for those dry bean growers in Eastern Canada if this is a viable option. So next slide. Finally, pre-harvest glyphosate. So really want to highlight here that from an MRL marketing concern, you know, the MRLs are established in all of our major markets. So for a while there, we didn't have Codex MRLs for some of our minor crops like chickpeas, faba beans. The Codex MRLs are now established. So when we look at all of our major markets, the glyphosate MRLs are typically at a level that's higher than the Canadian MRLs right now. So from an MRL marketing standpoint, you know, we're not a concern. You know, we have MRLs for glyphosate, pre-harvest glyphosate in many export markets. That being said, and I know Krista talked about this a bit earlier in the presentation, it's still a marketing risk due to whether it be consumer perception or kind of market-driven factors, where it's maybe a buyer placing potential restrictions. This is actually a big concern. You know, we do see more companies pushing towards glyphosate free. We're not here to debate that. You know, it's unfortunate because we do know this is a valuable tool for a lot of growers, not just pulse growers, but for other growers in general. So what we're highlighting here is that, you know, it's worth a conversation with the grain bar, just make sure if there's any restrictions there. But again, the focus comes back to how we're using the product. Make sure that we're using it in the right instances. You know, it's registered for pre-harvest weed control, not to be used as a desiccant. And that's really the focus of our messaging here. So we're not here to say, do not use it. What we're here is just saying, if you're going to use it, make sure you're using it properly. Jump to the next slide. So a couple ways to think about pre-harvest glyphosate to make sure we're using it properly and also getting the correct application down is, you know, we developed this flowchart a couple years ago just to get you start thinking about how we're using this product. So, you know, are you using as glyphosate as a desiccant? You know, obviously the answer there is no. So if you are using it as a desiccant to dry down that crop, please stop. That's not how it's supposed to be used and could potentially cause marketing concerns. You know, that's when we start to see those potential residues where you're trying to speed up the dry down of the crop, which glyphosate doesn't really work that way. And if you are using the product, you know, that 30% moisture content is that critical. You know, if you apply it below 30% moisture content in the least mature part of the field, that's when we know the residues will not cause concerns. So even though we have the MRLs established in all major markets, if you're applying above 30%, that's when you start having those marketing concerns and it does become an MRL issue. So applying to label directions below 30%, you know, we're usually in the clear from that standpoint on. So next slide. So just to help out a bit, you know, 30%, we're not walking around with moisture meters in many cases. So typically what we're looking for is visual characteristics in the plant. So this can be found on the label itself, but hopefully provide a bit of a guidance here on the pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. This is available on the Keep It Clean website, but also a lot of the commodity associations or grower groups do have more detailed information to help guide what 30% moisture content looks like. So not going to go through this in detail, but the resources are here. Make sure you're familiar and kind of, again, focusing on those least mature area of the fields and just highlighting again that 30% moisture content is absolutely critical. So we're really looking to get that right when using this product, again, for pre-harvest weed control. Next slide. You know what, from here, I'm going to pass it over to Ian from the Canola Council of Canada. Please, Ian, take it away.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, I'll give a bit of a canola perspective here. So we'll jump right in. Next slide. Yeah. The pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. So you've heard from Greg and Krista on the importance of glyphosate. It's a key tool for us for all the crops. And, you know, if we apply it correctly, it's an excellent tool. We have no market consideration, no market issues. Where we do have problems is if we apply it too early. And just there's a heck of a lot of scrutiny under this product. Globally, in Canada, it's under a lot of scrutiny, but it is an essential tool. So getting that timing right is really important in all the crops. I'll just give you a quick detail. We've heard enough about that, but in canola, what that looks like is again, below 30% moisture, that's 50 to 60% seed color change. And that I would stress here, especially going into a year when maybe depending on what region of the prairies you're from or familiar with, we've had lacking of moisture. It's the least mature areas of the field. And we have some fairly stagey crops out there. So we're looking at those greenest spots. They need to be 50 to 60% seed color change. So your classic swath timing in canola or so swath timing in canola, 56% least mature. Again, it's tough. It's easy to put it on a slide and say, yeah, swath timing, but getting that right and really scouting those green parts can be challenging. So at this stage, we're talking the top pods are green or top seeds are green, firm to roll. The middle ones, mostly brown with some speckling. And then the bottom ones are completely brown black. The one thing I would stress, just being in the field in the last week, we start to see some canola fields where from the road, you start to see yellowing across the crop canopy or maybe some purpling. We've had some hot days. We get the sun scalding. So we're talking seeds there, right? That seed color change. The pods can look dramatically different, both riper or less ripe than the actual seeds. So we really need to be cracking open those pods and looking at the seeds and through a variety of places in the field. Next slide. Other harvest considerations and market access considerations, pre-harvest scouting for blackleg. So swathing timing or that pre-harvest timing for glyphosate while you're in the field, swathing, spraying your glyphosate, that's 60% seed color change. Pull the plants, look for the blackleg. You want to pull at least 50 plants. You want to look at a variety, throughout the field. We want to rate them. This is really important information for, your current variety. How well did it do for blackleg? Should we be looking at switching varieties next time we grow canola on there? How much yield loss are we having from that? If you go to blackleg.ca, you'll get more information, some real details into it, but there's a pretty straightforward rating scale. Just have your clippers with you. Really key that we identify this disease. This disease can have market implications, and just agronomically, we don't want to be losing yield to this. Some of the other diseases in canola sometimes I think get a lot of attention, and they should. But blackleg is a sneaky one that can easily be robbing, 5 or 6 bushels here and there, and up to 10 bushels in some fields that I've been in the last couple of years. So it's one that creeps up on us, and one with good planning, we have the tools to deal with this disease. We just need to identify it in the field. Is it a problem in the field? And then, plan. At this point, we're planning for next year or for the next time we have canola on those fields. But good planning can really makes this disease a lot easier to manage. Next slide. So a couple of those tips: rotating through your crop. You want at least a 2-year break. If you have a big problem, that break is really key. We can really reset the blackleg inoculum in the field by having a good rotation. Again, that's scouting. And the key scouting right now is that swathing or pre-harvest glyphosate timing. And then we have lots of tools to deal with it, varieties, resistance. There's a lot of ways to get into the details of handling it. But the key thing, especially just the nuts and bolts practical for right now, is identifying, is it a problem in my field? If it's not a problem in your field, whatever your management strategy is working, that's great. Just good to note that. But if you do have a breakdown, and we do see fields that traditionally have been pretty good, but now are seeing a bit of a breakdown, time to up the management game. And then making sure we're controlling the volunteer canola and other brassica weeds in the non-canola years. I guess there's multiple reasons why you'd be doing that, but just an extra emphasis on clean fields in between canola crops. Next slide. Krista already talked a little bit about keeping your bins malathion-free. This is a long-standing message for Keep It Clean, and it's just a key reminder. This is one of those that kind of slips through the crack, and then we have the odd detect every once in a while. So if you are treating your bins, getting them ready for harvest, try not to use malathion. If you do use malathion, those are not bins for canola. That's where we do get detects and residues. And again, this is just a tough one to remind growers, or we don't often treat a lot of bins with products in between. So maybe it's something where you had a problem last year, you moved some grain here in summer, and you had some sort of problem, and you want to make sure you're clean starting. So maybe it's been years since you've applied a product in a bin, or it's those kind of things. So it's just one of these things that sneaks up. So just a reminder that the malathion residue can linger for months. So if you have a treatment since the bin was emptied, that's not a bin for canola. Label it, do whatever you need to do on the logistics side to make sure that the canola doesn't end up in those bins. Next slide. So the pre-harvest intervals for late season insecticides, we've already heard a little bit about what pre-harvest intervals are, just keeping an eye on them. The one thing I thought I would just highlight this year, especially in the canola world, but I know across commodity, we've had quite a few insects issues, grasshoppers in the southern regions of the prairies, quite a few diamondback calls and some lygus bugs in canola specifically. So we do have growers doing more late season insecticide applications, and there's a lot of variety of products available. There's a lot of overlap in, different products that all control similar, your Diamondbacks and your Grasshoppers. They all kind of work very similarly. The one thing to really highlight is this pre-harvest interval for late season. So they might work agronomically similar, but the pre-harvest interval might be quite a bit different. So we see products going from 21 days to 7 days to 1 day. So while agronomically they might be the same, you're going to get the control of the product depending on when you're going to harvest and how you're going to approach harvest. Might be good to just consider which one. So Keep It Clean, the website has this calculator. You can throw in, if you have 3 or 4 products that maybe you're interested in, throw in the calculator. Okay, I think I'm going to be swathing, or I'm going to be harvesting, 20 days, 15 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is. I think that's where I'm going to be at. And it'll just give you the list of products that are still available. So sometimes insects, they come out of the blue, or they're kind of a knee-jerk reaction. Suddenly there wasn't something, and suddenly, oh yeah, I got to spray for grasshoppers. They're demolishing the crop. Make sure you either have the products on hand that have a smaller pre-harvest interval, or quickly jump on the calculator and just make sure whatever product you're applying, you're good as you head into harvest. This is one of those last minute things. We're almost there. Nobody wants to spray that late season insecticide, but sometimes we do hit those thresholds. And this year seems to be a year where more people are unfortunately having to make that late season insecticide. Next slide. And I will pass it over to Krista.
Thanks, Ian. And I'll provide some additional information from the cereal side on pre-harvest glyphosate specifically. So as we mentioned, these staging guides are available on the Keep It Clean website. But when we think about cereal specifically and what we're looking for, really, again, it's that staging that we're looking for, that 30% moisture or less. And this is when we would be safe to apply that pre-harvest glyphosate. So when we want to assess what this looks like for 30% moisture in cereals, what we usually refer to is the thumbnail test. So this is something where you apply pressure to a grain kernel with your thumbnail, and you're looking for how the imprint reacts. So when you press your nail into it, if the imprint remains in the kernel, it's at that hard dough stage and it's ready for a pre-harvest glyphosate application. However, if you press your thumbnail into the grain and this indent springs back, this is likely to be telling you that your moisture is too high. So it's above 30% and you need more time for that crop to naturally dry down and lose some more of that moisture before you're making that application. And this is also keeping in mind, in addition to this, the label directions, which include that pre-harvest interval. So the timing to harvest after your glyphosate application is between 7 and 14 days, just keeping in mind environmental conditions and what you're looking at in the growing season. As well on here, we have a little bit of a snapshot of part of our advisory. So we talked about our product advisory and those categorizations that help make some recommendations. So as part of this, we do have that, all of wheat, barley, and oats may not be accepted if they're treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. So it's really important to be checking with your grain buyer before you make that spray decision or before you apply that glyphosate. And separated out from wheat, barley, and oats, I should specify that is barley for food or feed, would be malt barley. So malt barley is the exception, and it is something that will not be accepted by grain buyers if it is sprayed with pre-harvest glyphosate. Next slide, please. And as well, we do have the same kind of resources for assessing cereal crops for barley and oats. So you're looking for the same kind of a staging, so that 30% grain moisture, and you're looking again for that hard dough stage for the application. Next slide, please. And as well, when we think about steps for assessing this 30% moisture in wheat, we want to keep in mind that least mature part of the field. So again, we're thinking about trying to reduce our residue risks in every way possible. So when we do look at this least mature area, we want to stage based off this location and not necessarily just the field average. So what you see on the screen is you're looking at the stem just below the head. So we really want that to have lost the majority of its green color. Once this happens, the plant is considered physiologically mature. So what you can see in that top image, the stem just below the head in the first wheat plant is still quite green. The middle plant is clearing some of that green, but it's still quite, not yet ready. And then that third head has cleared all the green. So we would consider this a mature plant. And then what you see on the bottom part of your screen is what you want to do with that thumbnail test or with assessing the kernels. So you want to hand thresh out or shell out some of your wheat head, and you want to be assessing those kernels for that moisture using the thumbnail test that we've already talked about. Next slide, please. And then just to think about the products that are on our advisory that would have kind of that pre-harvest timing. So the first we have on there that has been on there for more than one season now, so it's not something new, is Chlormequat. So Chlormequat, or manipulators, it's more commonly known, is something that you want to, again, you want to check with your grain buyer about your contract obligations and your acceptance if you're using it for barley on either side. So whether for malt or for food and feed barley. Versus it is something that has a green, or as Greg mentioned, some of these are products you can use because they don't have a categorization. Those would be the green check marks, and those are for wheat and oats. Chlormequat is something that would be considered acceptable. And as Greg mentioned too, we do have some of those MRLs that are established for Chlormequat, but there are some markets where we have an MRL risk, and that's why it's additionally important to talk to your grain buyer before you're using that product. Next slide, please. And pre-harvest glyphosate. So I think I've mentioned most of the points on this slide, so we don't need to talk about it a terrible amount more, but just keeping in mind that it is a red on malt barley. So, not to be applying pre-harvest glyphosate on malt barley versus on oats and wheat and barley that's for food or feed. You want to be talking to your grain buyer just because of some of that market acceptance for pre-harvest glyphosate. Next slide, please. And the final one I want to highlight to you today about is saflufenicil or heat. So again, keeping in mind malt barley is kind of the outlier here, where grain buyers won't accept malt barley that's treated with saflufenicil versus it doesn't have a categorization on wheat or on barley that's for food or feed. So those are acceptable uses. And then keeping in mind that this one doesn't originate so much from an MRL issue in a particular country, but the reason for restricting or wanting to categorize saflufenicil on malt barley has to do with negative impacts on the malting process. So it is something that is acceptable on food and feed barley. Next slide. So just a reminder to always read and follow the label. And when we're talking about any of these products for pre-harvest, and this timing is just so critical, that we really do want to be thinking about, sticking to our rate, our timing, and our PHI, and really wanting to keep that market access open for all of our crop types. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff, for the next slide.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Krista, and thanks to all of our presenters. We do just want to remind everybody who's tuning in, and we appreciate everybody for sticking with us this long, of where you can find further information and resources on the Keep It Clean program, and on certainly as in the lead up to harvest here, to make sure that we're protecting the marketability of Canada's cereals, pulse, canola crops. So keepitclean.ca/tools, you'll find a bevy of resources there, with respect to different things that have been mentioned throughout this. So whether it's the pre-harvest staging guide, whether it's the spray the swath or the pre-harvest interval calculator, there's just a good amount of resources there. In addition to that, Keep It Clean is on Twitter quite actively sharing these kind of tips and tricks. Any one of us, from each of our associations, so Pulse Canada, Cereals Canada, the Canola Council of Canada, is available and ready to answer questions. It's important that we get it right. It's a joint initiative, and we know that those on the line here are really paramount to ensuring that we do protect the marketability of Canada's crops, and that we don't experience any hiccups as we head into a busy harvest season. So we'll move to the Q&A portion of the webinar now, and I invite our panelists back on screen. Just a reminder for anybody online, if you do have questions, you can pop them into the Q&A function on the webinar. I do have a couple from the chat here that perhaps we'll start with, and maybe first to you, Greg Bartley, as a question around providing an example of a buyer of pulses or a food company that is headed or is going towards glyphosate free. So maybe I'll kick that one off over to you.
Sure, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I think the biggest examples, and we know this for a while. So, I mean, when we look at the whole dry bean industry, we've seen all of the dry beans move towards essentially glyphosate free. Again, this isn't due to the MRL risk. This is really, the signal from the European Union and keeping up with a lot of our competitors. I think we saw the US move towards glyphosate free a bit sooner, and to remain competitive, Canada's had to follow suit. So, the dry beans, it's well known that the majority are glyphosate free. I guess another sample, if we look at our processing industry, we're Canada here in Manitoba. We do know that one of the stipulations is glyphosate free to deliver to their facility. So just a couple examples. I'm sure there's more out there, but we tend to not keep a tight wrap on who that is, but just a few examples there.
Thanks, Greg. We'll move on to another one, and this is maybe an open question for all of you. As an individual asking about the importance of evenly maturing crops in terms of maintaining MRLs, perhaps maybe with a reference to things like depth control, seed to fertilizer placement, plant populations, etc. So I will just lob that one into the three of you, and it looks like Ian's about to step up here.
Well, I think I'm the one that mentioned uneven crops, and I think some years are better than others, so maybe I should take a crack at it. Yeah, definitely. Uneven crops are much harder to manage. We talk about, certain stages, timing, and when you have a nice even crop, staging your crop from an MRL perspective is fairly straightforward. But when we have an uneven crop, it's throughout the whole growing season. Agronomic problems ends up being MRL problems. How do you stage it? Where's the bulk of the yield coming from your crop? From an agronomic perspective, you can kind of use that as your guiding tool. That's where the majority of the yield is. That's where I got to manage. But from an MRL perspective, even if the majority of the yield is, maybe at the right stage to apply glyphosate, we can have significant areas that are way outside of that and still end up with MRL or residue issues. So it definitely does get challenging. There's a number of things that growers can do to try to make their crops a little bit more even. Just with an eye on harvest now, it actually starts this year for next year's crop with harvest residue management. How are you spreading your straw? How are you managing that? That's going to tie directly in. So if you haven't checked, or if you have growers that haven't checked the straw chopper on their combine, now is the time, because that will make it much easier come seeding time. Certainly there's a lot of things with seeding, getting that crop out of the ground, even, mature, or even. So seeding depth, we want to be into the moisture, but in the canola world, not too deep is really key. Fertility, definitely. So whether you have a wide range of topography or some things going on, you can be there. Anyway, there's a lot of things that growers can do that will help make crops mature. A higher plant stand might helps tighten up that maturity window. If you have a really low plant stand, sometimes you have, especially canola will flower and we'll keep going, and we have some indeterminate crops that might keep going. So key things to consider, especially if you year after year have really uneven crops, there are definitely some things maybe to focus on. And then there's a whole other thing that is just Mother Nature. You can do everything right. You can have the plants come out of the ground, even a great crop, and then you get some hail damage, and now it's a schmoz. Or you get some flea beetle damage, and your great canola plant stand of 8 plants per square foot is now 3. And it's not an even 3. It's 7 over there and 1 over there and 2 here, and grasshoppers come and mow it in. Any of these things can make a mess. Lack of moisture, you have your tops of your hilltops dry out, and they're now 2 weeks ahead of your low spots that are grass green. How do you make a pre-harvest application on that crop, right? So again, there's only so much that can be controlled, and it is really challenging. So, and with glyphosate, we are, it's really about intense scouting come harvest, and there is only so much one can manage, but there are certainly crops that are a good candidate for a pre-harvest glyphosate application, and maybe some that aren't. It was the plan to pre-harvest them, but, we're looking at weed control here. For some of our perennials or winter annuals, maybe better off that that's a crop that now we're going to swath, and we're going to come in and we're going to post-harvest it. For certain weeds, our pre-harvest application is sometimes a bit early to get really good control of certain perennial weeds. So maybe we come in later and we do a great job after harvest, because that's just a safer way to come at it, and we actually get better weed control with our glyphosate. So again, there's a number of things to manage, but yeah, certainly if you regularly have uneven crops, there's a number of things you can do to try to tighten up that crop. And then Mother Nature will do what it does, and some years are better than others, and we're just kind of left to manage as best we can towards harvest.
Thanks, Ian. Krista or Greg, anything to add there?
Not much to add. I think Ian did a great job, and I like this because it focuses on the different management practices that can be applied on farm. Not does it help just the just general good practices for growing a crop, but it's thinking ahead, in this case right from the start of the season, of how the little decisions you make throughout the growing season have a long-term impact in terms of harvestability, but also marketing impacts too. So everything's related. I think that's why all the agronomists out there are doing a great job to think ahead of these different situations. And they think of a pre-harvest context too, that that early season weed control to make sure you don't have weed escapes at the end of harvest. Just great examples of how the agronomic package for the growing season really does help the marketability at the end of the season as well. So
great, thanks. That's gonna wrap it for today. So just a couple notes. As you exit, we ask you to please complete the Zoom feedback survey that'll pop up on your screen. We do appreciate your comments to help inform future webinars, help us get better at this kind of thing, because it is a very important topic. We will be emailing out a recap of the session, complete with a link. So please feel free to share it with your network. We mentioned the resources at keepitclean.ca. Please visit that. And if you do have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. On the website, you can also join our Keep It Clean e-newsletter to receive updates from Keep It Clean and the groups here about what's new and as things evolve. And so on behalf of the group, I'd just like to thank you all for joining and thank the speakers once again. And we will hope everybody has a great, what's going to be shortly afternoon here in Winnipeg. So thanks again.